views and opinions expressed by callers, guests, and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Scott still.
Cause we keep swerving, stay working, and you know we...
And good evening and welcome to this live broadcast of Black Talk Radio News. My name is Scotty Reed and I'm broadcasting from behind the enemy lines of USA Inc. It is a Thursday night on this February 21st in the year 2019. If you are on the line tonight, or if you're listening, we're using a different number tonight for security purposes because I've been getting a lot of hate directed my way on this topic by Twitter bullies, but you know, I know how to hit bullies in the mouth, you know, but if we're talking on Twitter, you just block them. You know, I'm all down for dialogue and hashing out differences, but when you start calling me out my name, when you start displaying your ignorance and what I'm not, that it ceased to be constructive, and therefore I take the advice of the counter-racist lecturer Neely Fuller Jr. and I'll cut off contact from you, because if there's no contact, there's no conflict. I have enough stress on me trying to maintain the world's largest independent, and when I say independent, I mean independent Black radio network that has a global audience. It's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. You know, being that we are independent Black media, and certain programs that's on the network is never going to be supported by corporate America. But with that said, I would never accept the support of corporate America, because then you open yourself up to control by corporate America, because then you're addicted to them butter biscuits. And you know, them butter biscuits be tasting so good, and you got a plate full of them. And then as soon as you start talking truth and speaking truth to power, then them butter biscuits start getting cut off. And you don't like that. So in order to maintain that supply of butter biscuits, you're going to engage in whatever it is corporate America, aka racist America, wants you to engage in. All right, so the title of tonight's program is Confronting the Xenophobia and Proxy Racism of the ATOS hashtag movement. Let me give you a description before I give you a definition, because definitions of words are very important. People use words incorrectly. They have nothing to do with the standard definition of those words. And I've long maintained that if we got different definition for the same words in the same terms, then that's confusion right there. So I try to stick to the standard definition. I do speak English. So I go with the English dictionary. This is not because I have a colonized mind or anything like that, although my tongue is colonized by way of me speaking the English language. But, you know, in this part of the world, that is how you communicate with other people, where there's a majority of English speakers. And then, of course, there's English speakers worldwide. Again, we do have a global audience. But let me give you a description and some background as we get into this conversation. Tonight on BTR News, we are joined by Brother Ross, and we're going to discuss the anti-African and xenophobic elements of the ATOS hashtag movement for reparations and why it is so offensive to many Afro-Descendant people, as its leaders and some of the followers are trafficking in stereotypes and the demonization of immigrants to the United States. After defending the movement against Russian bot accusations and just about to support it, I have to now distance myself from it and warn the audience of Black Talk Radio about the fallacies of joining a movement rooted in xenophobia and attacking Pan Africanism, and of course the attacks on the tradition of black radicalism. Afro-descendant immigrants have a history struggling side by side with black Americans in some of the greatest movements against white supremacy this nation has seen and have not witnessed since. People like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Toure, a.k.a. Stokely Carmichael, and American descendants of victims of slavery like Malcolm X, and I should add, Assata Shakur, who, if y'all was tuned in earlier, y'all heard that track from her talking about revolution is love. All right. And Malcolm X was assassinated on this date, however many years ago. And, this was shortly after, I would call, his second conscious awakening that came after his trips to Mecca and the continent of Africa to establish support on the continent for American blacks in the global struggle against white supremacy. I will also talk about the history of African Americans participating in some of the worst human rights crimes in U.S. history, like the extermination of American Indians in the West, the overthrow of Puerto Rican sovereignty, the overthrow of South American nations, and more recently, the murder of the Pan Africanist leader of Libya, resulting in the rise of open-air human trafficking, aka slavery, in one of the most prosperous nations in Africa. Gaddafi, again, a Pan-Africanist, murdered by Hillary Clinton with the blessings of Obama, even though Obama's saying it's a mistake. It was a mistake now. But Gaddafi attempted to give billions of dollars to help black Americans, but was blocked by the U.S. government without a peep from the Congressional Black Caucus before he was killed by jihadists, aided by the CIA, again, without protest, but praised by some black Americans like Reverend Bernice King. For those that don't know the background on that, when they had the anniversary of the Dr. King-led, civil rights-led march on Washington, D.C., Reverend Bernice King, crapping all over the legacy of her father, stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and said, let freedom ring in Libya, as American bombs bombed the infrastructure of Africa's most prosperous Pan-African nation, Libya. Now, Ross, give y'all some background on Ross. Ross is an American-born citizen of Trinidadian immigrants who has studied Pan-African history at the feet of black scholars in the New York area. And he will be talking with us about what seems to be the latest crab in a bucket expression by non-white people. Now, before I bring on Ross to introduce himself, I want to give some definitions of xenophobia, because you may not even know the definition of what you're practicing, and also a term that I believe I created years ago, although since then I've seen other people use it in a different context. So that's a term, let me give you the definition. My definition of proxy racism. Proxy racism, the actions of non-white people in a system practicing white supremacy against non-white people that aids and abets racists and harming non-white people through speech, thought, and actions, usually in pursuit of some tangible benefit from racist white people, aka butter biscuits. All right, xenophobia, this is the dictionary definition of xenophobia: dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries. The resurgence of racism and xenophobia is a sentence. Some of the synonyms of xenophobia is racism, racialism, racial hatred, ethnocentrism, ethnocentricity, and there's other pseudonyms for, or synonyms for, xenophobia. So that is the context of tonight's program. During the first half, the first half of this program tonight, we will talk about the xenophobia of this hashtag ATOS movement. Why do I call it a hashtag movement? The reason I call it a hashtag movement, because they don't have any formal organization. It's something that was born on the white corporate platform owned by Google called YouTube. And that's basically what it is. It's a hashtag. They created this hashtag to spread their propaganda on social media. So it's a hashtag movement. Until I see some, like I run the Black Talk Media Project, which is a registered nonprofit here in North Carolina, until I see some articles of incorporation of a formal organization, if we talking reparations like Cobra, and I may talk a little bit about Cobra. I have linked up with Cobra in the past in negotiating with them to start recognizing that slavery has never been abolished. The 13th Amendment carved out an exception clause that says if we convict you of a crime, we can throw you in slavery. And in 2014, I created the New Abolitionist Movement, standing on the work of those who came before me and who I credit as the modern father of the New Abolitionist Movement is Mr. Lee Woods, who wrote a book titled Prison Slavery in the 1970s. And so, in trying to get them to acknowledge, hey, we deserve reparations for what was done to our ancestors, that pre-1865 slavery. But since slavery continued in a new form by way of the 13th Amendment, some people also call it accurately prison slavery, then we deserve reparations for what followed after that. Okay? And so Cobra is a reparations organization that was started in 1987, and it's still around. And it's not just working with descendants of victims of slavery, but it's an international movement. You have reparation movements in different countries. You got them in the Caribbean, you got them in the UK, in Europe, you got them all over. So this is an international organization that is fighting for reparations, and they do support the H.R. 40 bill, I believe is what it's called, that is languished in Congress for all of these years. And so we'll be getting into a whole lot of stuff. We'll be getting into codification. We'll be getting into political strategy, and, as well as, why it is incorrect to engage in proxy racism towards non-white people, whether they be Afro-Descendant people, immigrants who have come here to the United States, or if it's Latinos. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I'll get later to some of the reasons why people are focused more on the symptom of this immigration instead of focusing on the problem, which is racist white people who created the conditions in these countries to force these people to leave their homelands. All right, so I've said a whole lot. Let me let Ross jump in here and introduce himself and give an opening statement as well. Okay, let me see. Ross, there you go. Oh, I'm sorry, Ross, I muted you. Let me unmute you. Still getting used to this old system I used to use. Okay. Hey, Ross, thank you for joining me tonight. And more importantly, thank you for being a supporter of the work of the Black Talk Media Project all these years. And not just a supporter by word, but a supporter financially, which is a deed. Thank you.
I thank you because without the hard work that you've put in to create this platform, I wouldn't have had access to incredible information that has changed my life over the years. So I appreciate it, and I've always talked about supporting Black business. That is something that has been a lifestyle for me and my family for a long time. And the business that you're in, as far as creating Black-owned radio platform and media platform as far as BTR community is something that is essential, I think, for us to be able to have the types of conversations we can have unimpeded by the colonist structure of media domination and control. These are this platform is one of the most necessary platforms and other platforms like it in creation. And the only way that these platforms will continue to exist to do the great work they're doing and to help the many, many people around the world that it's helping is with support. So I do implore everyone who is listening to the program and who listens to any of the other shows and partakes of the information that this network provides to please support. You can join BTR community for $24 a year. That's 50 cents a week. In order to help us to be able to continue to bring innovative programming that pertains to everything that we as Black people on a global scale need to know in order to live better lives and more codified lives in a global system of white supremacy, and just understand the different struggles of different groups of our people, no matter where they may be. So with that, I just will say a little about myself. Yes, I'm the sole person in my family born here. My entire family's from Trinidad and Tobago. I am also a co-host of the radio show, Real Life the Radio Show. I'm an essayist, African historian, and a writer. And I focus on African history, African spirituality, and the origins of hip-hop culture on the continent of Africa. That's been pretty much my focus for as long as I've been writing, as far as that's concerned. And other than that, I just love my people, wherever they may be. That's pretty much the gist of who I am, pretty much, as far as that's concerned. If you had any other questions, though, Scotty, you can always ask them anytime.
Now, you mentioned, or I mentioned, that you're a student of Pan Africanist history, Pan Africanist movement. You have studied at the feet of some well-known Black scholars. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? And some of those people were, let's just call them ATOS, American Descendants of Victims of Slavery, because, calling them slaves is a dehumanizing term that I was corrected. I used to use that term, but I was corrected by Afia Wangaza, who is an activist in South Carolina and an elder who runs the Malcolm X Center down there in Greenville, South Carolina, as well as a Black FM low power radio station, which I had the pleasure of going down there and helping her out with some of the stuff problems at her station. So who are some of those people that you learn from about Pan-African movements?
No problem. I started going to what was known then as First World Alliance in New York City, which was created by John G. Jackson, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen, Chancellor Williams, Dr. Chancellor Williams as well, and a few other African scholars of either American, Caribbean, or African descent that were in the New York area. And my father actually got connected to that specific group through Kwame Toure. He was in college at the time when he first got to the country. He was going for like an associate. And while he was there, he actually met Kwame Toure on the college campus, and they actually hung out on about 4 different occasions. He had said that they had quite a few profound discussions. They were both Trinidadian. They didn't know each other in Trinidad. They met each other in New York City. And during those conversations and the time they spent, he had put him in connection with what became First World Alliance. And my sister and I had started going from like the age of 5, maybe 6 years old. We would just go to lectures around New York City and in different parts of New Jersey, sometimes in Newark, Jersey City, but most of the time it was in New York City, around mostly Manhattan, but also in Brooklyn and some of the other boroughs. And basically we have different scholars come through every Saturday and Sunday, sometimes Fridays as well, and they would basically teach us about who we were. So it'll be Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Dr. Marimba Ani, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Minoko Rashidi, Chancellor Williams, John Jackson before he passed as well, and quite a few others. It's so many to run down, but these are all, the majority of these people are now ancestors. Some of them are still around. Tony Browder, there's a bunch of them, and ultimately these were the people who formed and shaped my consciousness at a very young age about who and what I was, And also, one of the main things they wanted to instill in me, which they did, and all of us that sat at their feet, was an innate love for our people, which was something I got at home first, and then they just reinforced it. And to be around these black men and women that were speaking in a way that nobody else in society spoke, to what was happening to us, to what our history actually was, and the lies that we were told, and unraveling those things, it was just a mesmerizing experience. So you're a child sitting around with quite a few adults, and we're sitting at the very front, and we're just watching them and listening to what they have to say and looking at the diagrams, and they're breaking a lot of things down. And as we got older, they just taught us about the importance of empirical research, and having great information. Make sure that you have everything you need to elucidate whatever facts you have, and that you can provide that information for other people to be able to do their own research. And these were all things that I took, and it became the foundation of what my writing career was after I stopped making music. So these are some of the giants whose feet I sat at, and I pay homage to them, and I will for the rest of my life, as well as my family. And did you have any other questions about that?
No, but I do have a question, a more personal question that I would like to ask you. And now, your parents were born in Trinidad and Tobago. They immigrated to the United States, and we had an earlier conversation, and I'd like to share that with the public, some of the things that they instilled in you as far as how you should interact with African Americans, Black Americans who were born here.
Yes, my parents are immigrants. Both of them came from Trinidad, but we have family from both islands, and it's a twin island nation, so it's called Trinidad and Tobago, but they were actually both born in Trinidad. They relocated here in the early 70s, about 71, and they came here because they were seeking a better life. There was a lot of things that took place in the family back in Trinidad that made it a necessity for my mother to leave, and my father decided to leave with her. So that's what they did. They relocated here. I was born shortly after they arrived. And as I grew up, it was an interesting childhood because at the time I was one of only two Trinidadian families on the block. And a lot of times back then, there was a sort of xenophobia because we spoke differently. And also my mother told me about hearing negative things about American Africans when she got here. So this is not something that, when I speak about it and have spoken about it previously, it's not something that I'm not speaking about from a lack of experience. As far as directly, no, but my parents told me about this. And ultimately, we were treated differently for most of my childhood. And eventually, as the culture shifted and reggae music became popular, and dance hall grew up alongside hip hop, then the behavior shifted, and we became way more accepted at that point. So it became actually easier for me as far as relating to American Africans, and I was immersed in hip hop culture from as young as possible. So that just made it all easier.
A point of clarification, Ross, if I may interrupt.
Sure.
You're saying how you were treated by American blacks as a child, right?
Yes.
That's what you're speaking to. You were mistreated. Okay.
Yes.
But what did your parents instill in you, the negative things that had been told to them about Black Americans? How did they you kind of hinted at it earlier when you was talking about your father and Kwame Toure, who eventually would wind up with the Black Panther Party, and who is a intellectual giant in Black American struggle.
Absolutely. So this is my parents. What my parents told me was this. They said to me, we came here and were able to start a new life here and do good for ourselves to try and make a way for you and your sister. Now, we didn't come here at the bottom of a slave ship. We were able to take a plane and, come and be in the city environment and live a pretty good life compared to what she was leaving behind. And she said, my dad specifically said, the people who were here before us had to fight to make a way for us to not come here in the bottom of a slave ship and in chains. And it's their struggle that is providing the benefit for us to come here and be treated as human beings in some capacity, coming back through an airplane rather than the bottom of a slave ship. So they made it clear that there's a special type of respect that I have to have because we are in someone else's house. And my dad put it in the sense that these people in America are your cousins. We were all on the same ship. We just got dropped off way earlier than they did. And they have now gone through their struggle, which has provided a way for us to come here and set up for a new life. So these are people that you have to respect. And we have to make it a point that you understand what they did to make it possible for you and your sister to be here in this country, and your parents, me and your mother, to be here in this country and do the things that we do and attempt to live the life that we're living. And that's what I was provided through sitting at the feet of those giants, was an understanding of the struggle of American Africans in order to make it better for themselves, and how everyone else benefits every time black people do something in this country. There's not a group in this country. When you make things better for American Africans, it's better for everybody. It's almost like a form of osmosis. And that is just the understanding that I grew up with from what my parents instilled in me, and also what these elders instilled in me, was that kind of respect is extremely important, because it's no different than somebody coming into your house and disrespecting you on a personal level. You're not going to tolerate it. You might end up having the cops called to your house, depending on the personality type of the person that it's happening to, and their lack of tolerance for it. And it's the same sort of thing. I'm coming to another country looking to get opportunities, and there were people here before me that made it possible for me to be able to do that with a semblance of human decency, rather than coming in the bottom of a slave ship. So that was something that was totally understood, and it was something that I always walked with no matter where I went. And it was something that was instilled in me repeatedly throughout my life. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was something that was reinforced. And it didn't really have to be reinforced, because I understood it. And when I understood it, there was nothing else left to be said about it. It's something that just becomes a way of life. That's just the type of person I am. So it's just maintained and grown, and I was able to pass that on to my son. But my son his mother's a American descendant of victims of slavery herself, so he understands his history as well, and especially the one coming from his mother's side of the family. So, yeah, that was the message that I was told about my brothers and sisters here, and the importance of respecting them and respecting their struggle and paying honor to those ancestors whose blood was shed on this soil. Mm-hmm. And that's just, like I said, a way of life for myself and my family.
Now, speaking of your family, you're married now. You have your own family. You have children.
Yes.
You're married to a Black American descendant of victims of slavery. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. All right.
24 years now, going on 25.
Wow, that long?
Yeah, it doesn't seem that long, but yes, it's shocking to me this time has flown like it has, but yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Have y'all had conversations about like what we're seeing today? And there's always been there. I don't want to act like it's anything new. There's always been a level of xenophobia in the Black community, as you experienced as a child. But did you and your wife have conversations about anything like that?
Absolutely. She used to tell me stories about her childhood growing up in Trenton, New Jersey. And she said that when she was young, they didn't know, and her parents actually reiterated that to me at one point in our relationship, that they didn't know about the myriad of islands in the Caribbean. So the only island they actually knew was Jamaica. So for every one of the people from the islands, they would just assume that you were Jamaican, or that's what the average person would call you. It was almost like the vernacular for anyone that was Caribbean. And again, she said the same thing, that as Caribbean culture became more accepted via reggae music coming to this country, and then of course the development of dancehall and all of that, then she even reiterated that we became much more accepted. And at that point, people started to get a better understanding of the myriad of islands that made up the Caribbean, and that people come from these different islands. So that was how she was pretty much introduced to it. But she said that they used to, like, as a child, not her, but just black people in the neighborhood would say things like, go back to Jamaica, go back on the banana boat. These were all xenophobic comments that were directed at Caribbean-born children, or anyone pretty much with an accent that they assumed was Jamaican. And this was something she told me on her own, and we had conversations about my upbringing and my experiences in Brooklyn being quite similar to hers. And she also talked about some of her experiences with Caribbean people, because she ended up traveling to England, and she stayed with some British-born Caribbean folks and spent time with African-born Caribbean folks, and talked about the clashes that took place regularly between those two groups, where you had black people from Africa that were British and Caribbean African British people who did not get along, and they couldn't stand each other. And then she was about 16 when she took that trip to England with a group of people, and she said that she had never seen anything like it as far as just the vitriol they would speak of each other. So these are things we talked about before. And she also had good experiences with Caribbean people that we discussed as well. And she always had connections with Caribbean people throughout her life. So whether they were friends of hers or family members that married into the family by marrying one of her aunts or something of that nature. So she had different connections with people, and she became quite fond of these folks. And then when she met my family, then it was just pretty much what it was. And we all kind of became very, very close once we got together and my son was born. So, yeah, we definitely had conversations about these types of things, exactly whether it's xenophobia or the lack of understanding of Caribbean culture, and the fact that there were many different nationalities within that umbrella of Caribbean, and all of those things. Some of the stories are funny, some of them are just, what they are. And we definitely have, and she has quite a few stories about that too.
You touched on something. I had asked a question earlier today on social media, on my Twitter. Y'all can follow me on Twitter at Black Talk Radio. I had asked a question about, and it's a question concerning logic. It's a question concerning critical thinking. And the question that I asked, and you've known me for quite some time, we've had many different conversations. You've heard me on my program. I've participated on your program, listen to you. Yeah. Again, we have our own social media community called BTR community. And so you see the things that I post. And, I have talked about even though there has always been some pushback, mainly against white people, and I understand why it was pushed, there would be pushback against suspected racist white people who want to say, well, Africans sold you into slavery too. And they would use that as a deflection when they are challenged. But it is the truth. It's the truth that Africans sold other Africans into slavery. I posted about the Kingdom of Dahomey, when that king in that West African nation who had a tradition of enslaving other Africans before they even came into contact with Europeans. And when the British, who was the superpower, I would say probably the sole superpower at the time, and they were abolishing this transatlantic slave trade, and they went to the king and they said, you can't sell any more victims into slavery. You can't do this anymore. And he started crying. He not literally crying, but I should say whining that, well, what would we do? Our mothers sing stories to their babies about enslaving our children. Enslaving our enemies. So because people have accused me that don't know me, they don't know my long documented history of doing internet radio, going back to 2007 and establishing independent black media digital radio platform in 2008. And I've talked about all of these things. We have covered so many different topics, all from all over the world, and all these different issues and what have you. So you know that I have called out Africans for preying upon weaker tribes and then selling them to Europeans. And then I was saying that
Absolutely.
that if you have this view of Africa that you think that Europeans or Arabs just ran up into Africa, raiding villages and all that, well, that you have a very low opinion about Africans, as if they were just so weak that these white people just came over there and just started taking people and loading them on the ship. That is not what was happening. The kingdom of Dahomey, and that's just one of the kingdoms that was practicing slavery. There were other tribes that would sell victims to the Portuguese. Some would sell them to the British. Some would sell them to the Belgians. Just all of Europe, Arabs as well. Okay, and they were the ones who were capturing these victims, and then they were the ones who were chaining them up and marching them on them ships after they were paid by their slaver customers. So when people say, I don't never criticize that, you do. We're not even talking about those issues. We talking about xenophobia and the hatred that I'm seeing expressed in this ATOS movement, which just 2 days ago, I posted a video defending when mainstream media came after y'all saying y'all were bots, and how I linked that to the wider what can I call it? The wider disinformation program that targeted Donald Trump, that targeted Roy Moore, and blaming the loss of Hillary Clinton on some Russian bots. And so I said, and I even tagged one of the creators, Yvette Carnell, and pointed her to the company New Knowledge, which is still on Facebook, still on Twitter, but got banned by Facebook for creating bot accounts that they were then putting out there talking about, the Russians supporting Roy Moore against the Democrat Doug Jones. I said, this is why Angela Rye, this is why MSNBC, they're trying to link y'all to this wider disinformation campaign to discredit people by claiming that y'all a bunch of Russian bots, that y'all under the control of Putin. Now, I was just defending them. But then I was reminded of their xenophobia, which I did witness in some of the earlier videos. And, but I don't watch a lot of other videos because I have, I listen to a lot of programming on Black Talk Radio Network. So, I got these ATOS hashtag people making accusations towards me, creating this false narrative towards me to cultivate hate towards me as if I'm some kind of fool or lackey and don't know that bad people exist all over the world. So you're a witness to that, okay? Of me calling out these things. I think somebody said something to me today on Twitter saying, well, you see he ain't call, even though we wasn't talking about Nigeria, you see he ain't calling out them Nigerian elites for killing their own people for oil money, when years ago, when that story first broke about the Nigerian military attacking this village and murdering all those people so that ExxonMobil could go in there and grab that oil. Now I'm saying, so now you're saying it's Nigerian elites, but before you're blaming all 100 million or however many Nigerians as being hateful and enemies of American blacks. So my question is, what are your initial thoughts on this ATOS xenophobia that you have witnessed that I think is the persons most responsible for that are the leaders, and I'm gonna call them out: Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell.
Yes, both of them have a history of being anti-immigrant, anti-African, anti-black, and I mean making blatant, direct statements. Even Claude Anderson has done that before too, and he's, from what I understand, one of the people who propagated this whole thing before both of them. And there was another person who did it before him. I don't remember the person's name, But that's just from the research I've been doing and the information I've been gathering. And what I'm seeing is, because this isn't new, none of this is really new. Just like the Aboriginal movement is not new. Dr. Ben talked about that back in the 80s with us, and discussed the fact that it wasn't new either. And he always said that it's really about trying to disconnect themselves from being African, because being African in some people's minds automatically equates to slavery. And it's just because in the modern times, we have been placed as the quote-unquote poster children of what slavery is. So anytime you say slave, people automatically think African, when there were slaves of every race possible, and the original slaves were European. That's where the word slave comes from, the word Slav. So ultimately, we're so embarrassed with that history. I don't understand why, because you were victimized. It wasn't like they went willingly and said, yes, I would love to be a slave in another country and be abused and mistreated intergenerationally in perpetuity. They were prisoners of war who were kidnapped and enslaved. And that is pretty much the gist of it. But a lot of people are so harmed psychologically by that history that they want to distance themselves from anything to do with being quote unquote black in some cases, which would also in some vernaculars connotate African or anything African. And I just see this now because you had a myriad of different movements that have popped up in the last year to 2 years, and all of them are just about varying forms of anti-Africanness in some way. And the Aboriginal movement was one last year. Now this year we have the ATOS movement. And what I'm finding is the people who are anti-black in that movement, because not all of them are. So I want to make that crystal clear. It's not everyone.
I'm glad you said that. Let me just interject right now, because some of the people who are now using that ATOS hashtag have been following Black Talk Radio Network and me personally on social media for a long time, and are still supporters of mine. So I'm not saying that every person using the ATOS hashtag to advocate for reparations is engaging in anti-blackness and anti-Africanism, and even attacking Pan Africanism and those of our ancestors who practice Pan Africanism, like Malcolm X. So I'm glad you put that disclaimer, because I don't want to do what they're doing. And what they're doing,
no indictment on everyone.
Yeah, and what they're doing is what they learn from racist white people, because that's what racist white people do.
Exactly, because the entire system is based on exclusion. Human beings are social creatures. So when you exclude people, that is where the systemic mistreatment comes from. And now we're doing it to each other. And the thing that I see about it is that they're just anti any other immigrant, and especially for some reason black immigrants. Now, some of them, those who do practice this anti-blackness and this anti-immigrant xenophobia, black immigrant xenophobia, they'll say that these people are coming here and taking our jobs. A lot of times, Caribbean people end up taking jobs that most American Africans will not take. When my mother was a home attendant, which is what she did when she first got here, she took care of elderly white people. A lot of them were actually racist, and she just had a few incidences with racist, rich, white, elderly people where she practiced black self-respect, and she had told me some of those stories coming up that just blew my mind, but she was a recent immigrant, so she was not used to this sort of acute, intimate racism on that level, but she responded the way that she should have as far as practicing black self-respect. Now, she never saw American Africans taking any of those jobs. Everybody who took those jobs were either of African descent or African Caribbean descent.
Today, most of them are Latino or Hispanic.
Right, and absolutely. And those are jobs that most American Africans will not take. They don't want to do that job. So it's either that, or they try to get some sort of an education and use that to go into the trades, which is what my father did. Or they go to school and get a degree and try to get a decent paying job. They got the same spiel that we get here. Your job is to go to school, get a good education, and find a good job working for somebody else. Some of them have the entrepreneurial spirit and have created myriads of businesses all around the country, and I know for a fact all through New York City. And the xenophobia is, it doesn't make sense to me because there's too many connections. First of all, the overwhelming majority of American Africans that came to the mainland United States came from the Caribbean. There were very few ships that came directly from West Africa to the coast of the United States. So I would say 85 to possibly 90% of them came through the Caribbean islands and then dropped these people off on the mainland.
Would it be correct to say that the Caribbeans was like a holding
Yes.
area?
Yes, because that was the Caribbean islands were a big part of the seasoning plantation process, and the seasoning plantation process was the process of breaking slaves to make them pliable and less apt to revolt and practice any black self-respect once they were on the field. So these were the places where people were most dehumanized, most terrorized and abused. They used to practice buck breaking, which was the act of pretty much raping what they would call a recalcitrant Negro, which was basically a black male who was an alpha male and did not accept enslavement. So they would basically have him publicly raped in front of his wife, his children, and up to 200 plus slaves would be rounded up to watch this male be emasculated in the most horrific ways. And it was in order to instill the fear in them that if you try to act like this one, this will be your fate too. And that was what a big part of what happened in the islands, so that these slaves were considered much more pliable once they got to the mainland. If the slaves still was acting up once they got to the mainland, they would send them back to the island. And usually they would be treated even worse than that. And with that, once they knew that the person was broken, then they would send them back to the mainland. So this is documented. There's a great book called All God's Children by a man named Fox Butterfield. And it's about Willie Bosket, which is the first child in the United States that was arrested and tried as an adult and put in adult prison in New York City. And they trace his family history back to South Carolina. And they talk about the fact that the overwhelming majority of slaves in South Carolina came from Barbados, and that there was to this day, a heavy Bajan cultural expression in that area that owes back to the original Bajan slaves that they brought there. So this history is there. It's for anyone who studies it. The majority of slaves that came here came from the Caribbean. And they were African Caribbeans, so they came from Africa first to the Caribbean, and then they were shipped to the United States from the mainland. So this is the actual history. So if you're castrating yourself from immigrant Caribbeans, you could be castrating yourself from your own relatives and not even be aware of it. And there's so many contributions Caribbean people made to the Americas. You had over 500 Haitian soldiers that came to this country and fought, I believe it was in Virginia, with the United States to help them during oh man, slipping my mind right now.
Which war?
It was the war against England.
War 1812?
Yeah, like they came and they fought and they died here. These were Haitian soldiers. And to this day, America is a big part of the continued reparations that Haiti is still paying to France. So these are people who came from another country and actually laid blood on the soil here. And they're still getting disrespected by American citizens as well as the American government. So there's too many connections there for you to take that approach. And it doesn't make any sense because we've been here long enough. Immigrants have been here long enough and have experienced the same terrorism that American Africans experienced.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm getting older now, Ross. And sometimes my mind wanders, so excuse me, but let me do this. Okay. Let me open up the conversation to anybody who wants to chime in. We will be going to a break here shortly. Tonight I'll also be playing some clips that are relevant to the conversation, mainly from Malcolm X because it's the anniversary of his assassination. And as I put out on Twitter today, the U.S. didn't really see Malcolm X as a threat. When he was in the Nation of Islam and he was talking about the blue-eyed white devil and he was hating on black Christians and stuff, they didn't see that as no threat. Okay, it was after he went to Mecca. I forgot what kind of Muslim he became, because you got different sects in Islam like you got in Christianity. But he went, and that was what was it?
I believe he was Sunni.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Correct, but I believe it was
yeah,
Sunni.
but it led to a spiritual awakening for him in terms of Islam. Then he traveled to Africa, and he's doing this. This is an American descendant of victims of slavery, Malcolm X, who then traveled to Africa to meet up with African leaders and whatnot, and how they can help Black Americans in their struggle by applying pressure through the United Nations and what have you. So in honor of Malcolm X, who inspired me with his quote about the power of media, he inspired me to create the Black Talk Media Project. So we'll be playing some clips on him about Pan Africanism. I also got a clip that I'm gonna share at the break from Mr. Neely Fuller, because when we really break it down, this is all about justice. Either you practicing justice or you practicing injustice. In my mind, there is no way you can justify a form of racism, or more accurately, if we talking about Black immigrants, proxy racism. There's no way you can justify xenophobia. You have to rely on anecdotal evidence, which isn't evidence at all, okay, and drum up hatred for whoever your target is, whether it's Nigerians, whether it's Ghanaians, whether it's South Africans. What you got to drum up hatred for them. I don't see how that equals justice. I don't see how that is producing justice. So I will play that clip, because I ain't heard it in a while, and I think it's a very accurate statement Mr. Neely Fuller, a counter-racist lecturer, made about practicing justice and what have you. But there was something that you said, and my mind started to wander. Please excuse me, because it's been these past few months have been very, very stressful for me. And you had mentioned about your mother's experience when she went to the UK and she witnessed what I'm gonna call tribalism. Okay.
Yeah, that's my wife. Yeah.
Yeah, you said it was between African-born immigrants and Caribbean-born immigrants.
Yes.
That was still Afro-Descendant, but the animosity and vitriol and hate that they have for one another, that's the form of tribalism I'm talking about. Because I put a question up on Twitter. I asked the question, if tribalism, again, this goes back to what I said about the kingdom of the home and preying on weaker tribes to enslave them and sell them off to Europeans, if tribalism facilitated the transatlantic slave trade, can tribalism repair the damage done to the descendants of these victims of slavery? That's a logic question. Okay, that's a logic question. Somebody said, well, tribalism can be good, and I ain't talking about no good tribalism. That ain't really tribalism when you talking about celebrating your own unique culture, which Caribbeans have their unique culture, African Americans have their unique culture, and although, in this day and time, they become blended, especially through hip hop and music, the cultures have been mixed, as well as fashion and what have you. But that's what it reminded me of. I ain't talking about love for your own unique culture. I'm talking about tribalism, and not just Africans practice tribalism. Before Europeans came to North America, American Indian tribes was fighting each other, enslaving each other, and killing each other, and taking each other's lands. So tribalism is a universal thing. So that's my question, and I'll put that out there. Can tribalism, since it facilitated the transatlantic slave trade, does it make any sense that tribalism will heal any victim or repair the damage done to any victim of descendants of slavery? American victims, Jamaican victims, Haiti victims, Trinidadian victims, Tobago. It just goes on and on.
My answer to that is you can't use the same methods that got you messed up to try and fix it. It's insanity to me for you to think that the same tribalism that put you into enslavement via being a prisoner of war is going to be the liberating factor. That is incredibly nonsensical to me. I said this the other day, I think it was on Tando, that we're seeing a rift now in the global powers that practice white supremacy as far as the different countries. They're turning against each other. And I said that when they partitioned Africa in the late 1800s, they were all on the same page, and they actually put aside their differences to function as a superorganism, and they partitioned Africa, and we know what the rest of the history is. Now, they are so enraptured in nationalism that they're making sure that the best interest of each nation is put first. So they're circumventing U.S. sanctions and still doing business with the non-white countries that they need goods and services from. So what you're seeing is the breakup of white supremacy, where it's now going to be isolated in pockets, and different nations are going to be doing what they do to get their peace, no longer collective. And if you look at that, again, when they were together in some form or fashion, they successfully partitioned Africa and have been vampiring the continent ever since. And what do they fight most in this country? When does all of the leaders get killed, whether it's Thomas Sankara, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, you could just run the list, Patrice Lumumba, Stephen Biko, when you start talking about black unification, when you talk about Pan Africanism. Because if you look at China, no one on the planet that's Chinese can be mistreated in any other country and not have China as a nation respond. We saw that with the Huawei arrest in Canada. When they arrested that Chinese migrant, China arrested 2 Canadians. And they had to start working on something diplomatically and politically. That's because China has now become such a power. They will not tolerate disrespect of Chinese people anywhere on the planet. Early in American history, Chinese people used to be called chinks, and they'd be made fun of. You're not going to do that today. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. China's not having it. And Malcolm X said the same thing about the global black diaspora. When Africa's on top, the same thing will happen. You will not be able to disrespect an African without multiple countries, and if they do complete the process of becoming the United States of Africa, the entire continent putting their weight to bear on whoever's trying to disrespect their people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're trying to do here, is create a systemic connection amongst our people, which is what Malcolm X was killed for. And for everybody to read The Judas Factor, The Plot to Kill Malcolm X by Carl Evans, it tells you exactly why he was killed. It was because of his Pan-African model and his ability to connect the global non-white community, Asian, Latinos, and the global African community to bring to the United Nations human rights atrocities against all the European powers for the enslavement and domination of non-white people. And they had to stop that, which meant making sure that he was gone. And him and Martin were on the same page.
Yeah, they were getting on the same page.
Of their lives.
Yeah,
yep.
Because
ahead, I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, because I know, I would even call it tribalism when the Nation of Islam using Malcolm to attack black Christians who have been the backbone of black resistance in this country. I mean, those were the majority of the people who signed up to put their lives on the line during the Civil War. They are the ones who ran the Underground Railroad. And I don't wear my spiritual beliefs, which I am a Christian. I'm not ashamed of that. I don't wear it on my sleeve, because I have been reading a long time. I came into consciousness later than you. I didn't start coming into my consciousness until I started reading Malcolm X's biography, while I was sitting over there in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, helping the white supremacists of America kill non-white people and steal the oil over there. That's when I came into my consciousness. But Malcolm X I talked earlier about him coming into a second consciousness. And Pan Africanism and him and Martin, Dr. King were going to work together, and that's why he established the Organization for Afro-American Unity as a non-religious organization to end that tribalism. See, the tribalism don't benefit the divisions among different victims, no matter where they are in the world, benefits only one person, and that's or benefits only a certain group of people. And to borrow a term from Gus of Context of White Supremacy, and that's racist man, racist woman, racist child, aka racist white people. They have been exploiting differences, facilitating differences, and even creating differences. If you look at the destruction of the Black Panther Party and the tribalism that erupted in that, you had American descendants of slaves working for the FBI who infiltrated the Black Panther Party to destroy it from within. Okay, so I'm going to take a break and open up the phone lines. The telephone number is 712-770-4160. That's 712-770-4160. The extension or the code is 269626. That's 269626. If you're on the line and you want to make a comment, just hit *6 on the keypad. If you're using a web phone, it has a dial pad. Hit *6. That will put you in the queue, and I will bring you on board. Ross, I'm going to take a break at this time. We're going to hear from Neely Fuller. We're going to hear from Malcolm X, and then we'll come back and we will continue this conversation. You were tuned.
Just to say it's *61.
Are you sure *61?
Yeah, it's *61. Yeah.
Or
That's
is that our other conference line? I think it's *6. The lady, the lady will tell them, it's *6 because I tried it earlier. You're thinking about, our permanent line that we use, but I didn't want to use it tonight because of security reasons. All right.
No problem. My bad. Let me mute myself.
All right. You're listening to Black Talk Radio News with Scotty Reed as I broadcast from behind the enemy lines of USA Inc. We are part of the Black Talk Radio Network. It's the world's largest independent black media podcasting and digital radio broadcasting platform in the world. It is managed by Black Talk Media Project, a North Carolina-based nonprofit, and we're only able to continue our operations by donations from the people. We don't take grant money. We don't even seek grant money. We don't want nothing from the U.S. government. We don't want nothing from these corporations. We don't want nothing from these white foundations. But if we are to survive and maintain our independence and ability to speak truth to power, then it must be supported by you, the listeners. Find out how you can contribute by just giving $24 a year. You can become a podcaster on our media platform. You will also get access to our social media platform, which is btrcommunity.com, very similar to Facebook. And there are some other benefits as well. All right, so we're going to take this break. On the other side, as we continue this discussion with my Pan African brother in the struggle, Ross.
Because it's evil. Well, white supremacy is a system. And what does white supremacy really mean? It just doesn't mean somebody being in charge. No one should care about who's in charge of anything if the person is not mistreating people. White supremacy is about mistreating people based on what? Based on the color in the skin of those people who are being mistreated. That's all it is. It's a form of mistreatment. There are all kinds of mistreatment in the world, but that's the greatest form of mistreatment. That's why it's supreme, because it's the greatest form of mistreatment. If you want to look for mistreatment of the people anywhere on the planet, most people are being mistreated based on color. That's what it is. If it's just two people on earth, one person might mistreat another person just because the person is jealous or envious or something. There's all kinds of ways to mistreat people for all kinds of reasons. But this business about racism is about mistreating people based on color. No, it really isn't. Because, see, people are thinking in terms of, well, they want to brag about being black, which means that they are implying that there's something incorrect about being white, even though these are the creations of the Creator. See, and then so everybody gets into this black pride thing or white pride thing, and people immediately start taking sides. It's not about taking sides based on black and white. It's about taking sides based on justice and non-justice. Well, that's what you're really aiming for. Being black doesn't mean anything if you don't believe in justice. And being white doesn't mean anything if you don't believe in justice, except you believe in non-justice. And that doesn't make any difference what shade you are, or how tall you are, or who your cousin was, or anything like that, or what so-called nationality you have. Like a lot of people say that they take pride in being an Englishman, or take pride in being a Frenchman, or take pride in being Afrocentric. Well, you're not supposed to be proud of any of those things if you don't believe in justice, because these words mean nothing. No nationality means anything. And waving a flag if you don't believe in not mistreating people. You've got to believe in not mistreating people, and you got to believe in helping people that need help the most. Otherwise, you don't even have any business breathing.
And we just heard from, that was Mr. Neely Fuller. I'm having some technical difficulties here. I want to cue up this clip by Malcolm X. Before I cue this clip up by Malcolm X, I want to say that last clip that I played, Mr. Fuller, where he said, it don't matter about your skin color if you don't believe in not mistreating people, if you don't believe in practicing justice, that, and then he mentioned, it don't matter about your nationality. You want to brag about being, let's say, Jamaican, or you want to brag about being Haitian, or you want to brag about being an American descendant of slavery, but you don't believe in not mistreating people and practicing justice. And I've yet to understand, and I've had several conversations today, but I've yet to have anybody explain to me why it's necessary to engage in xenophobia, to advocate for reparations for myself. Why do I need to demonize a Nigerian or a Trinidadian or Jamaican? Why, if my beef is with the people who enslaved my grandfather's people, not with that Jamaican, not with that Trinidadian. It's with the white people the descendants of the white people who practiced slavery against my grandfather, who was ADOS. I've yet to hear a logical explanation of why. Cobra's been around for a very long time, since 1987, advocating for reparations for African Americans, not anyone else. But I have yet to see any members of Cobra get on the air, and I've interviewed some of them. I've had conversations with them, negotiations with them in terms of incorporating new abolitionism into their platform. And when they talk to people, yes, we want reparations, but we need to end slavery first. That comes first and foremost, ending slavery. I don't see how you're going to have a reparations movement asking for compensation for what was done for your ancestors, and what was done to your ancestors is being done to our members of our community today through prison slavery via the 13th Amendment. But here is Malcolm X talking about Pan Africanism, because, Ross, I was told Pan Africanism is dead. And if Pan Africanism is dead, it's because the United States and other European nations aided by black victims, confused victims, like I was confused when I was in the military about me being a tool of white supremacy. But, you know, I was told today that why it's unreasonable to expect Americans, descendants of slavery, to be the sole ones to fight against American imperialism, aka white supremacy. First of all, that never came out my mouth. I never said it was solely on African Americans. But is it asking too much for African Americans or anybody, because it's open, the U.S. military is open to immigrants, okay, and they actively recruit immigrants and promise them citizenship if you'll just sign up and let Uncle Sam send you to some white, non-white country, overthrow it, kill the people, and steal the resources, okay? Okay, so that, I don't think it's too much to ask of you doing the same thing I did with my children. My daughter, one of my daughters expressed to me, I want to join the U.S. Air Force. I was like, you know what? I know I was in the military, but I don't want you following in my footsteps. Number one, it's a force of evil in this world and spreading white supremacy. Number two, you're a female, and they raping females left and right in the U.S. military. And I told her about PFC Lavina Johnson, okay, who was found raped, murdered, and burnt in a tent while she was serving this country in Iraq. How is it too much to ask of African descendant people not to be weapons of literally weapons of white supremacy by donning that uniform, picking up that weapon, and going where they tell you to kill white people? That ain't too much to ask. Don't you know? See, what you want to do is play the victim, but you don't want to acknowledge our role in helping these people victimize other people. But this is Malcolm X on Pan Africanism.
Nature of the situation which is making black people more receptive.
You take in the past, say, 15 years, how the nations have emerged, dark nations have emerged in Africa. Prior to 10 years ago, most Negroes identified Africa with a savage, jungle-like place. And whenever you mentioned the word African, in their mind's eye, they could see the image of someone running around with a spear, with no language, who'd say Ugga Bugga Boo or Bwana or something, and who'd be in a jungle running from lions or chasing lions. But then when, after the war, when the United Nations was set up in New York City, black people began to look at men like Tom Mboya. They began to look at men like Nkrumah. They began to see men like Lumumba. They began to see men like Nasser. They began to see these Belawa and Ezekwe, who could exchange intellectually with whites on an international level in a political forum and hold their own. This made the black people in this country realize that what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had been teaching all the time actually had substance. And they began to turn it over in their mind and see that what he was saying had more weight to it than what these other Negroes were saying. And they began to identify themselves with the black world and the black struggle more closely than they identified themselves with this so-called white world.
You know, Ross, just the other day I heard Yvette Carnell talking about embracing her Americanism. And I was like, wow. And what Malcolm X is talking about there is the same thing we talking about today. The same, like you said earlier, Ross, this ain't new. This xenophobia, this anti-Africanism is not new, okay? It's just a new generation that's carrying on the foolishness of past generations. And where did those xenophobic African Americans get this derogatory view of Africans from? They got it from white people. Ross?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I just think today, via the advent of social media and media itself, the ease of propagating, this is not the age of information, it's the age of misinformation. Because to find information, you have to know how to do proper research. And research is not just searching on Google or some search engine. You have to really, really do research, pick up books and actually read them and study them and dissect them and be able to separate the meat from the meat from the bones when you're reading what you read, and read it in the context of having a white supremacist lens. Because if you're reading a book by a white person, you're probably going to find at some point that they might practice racism in the text. So you have to also think about that. And you cross-reference. And there's no legitimate reason for anyone to be, any immigrant to be upset that American Africans are seeking justice for the wrongs of their ancestors and the atrocities committed up till today. And I agree with you, Scotty. Why are you fighting for reparations when the terrorism hasn't stopped? Are you going to have a setup where you get reparations in perpetuity because they're just going to continue to kill you in the street and us in the street because all of us are getting it? They don't care what island you're from. They don't care what accent you have. As long as you have dark skin or they interpret you as a person of African descent, you could get the bullets all day. And there's more than enough of immigrant people on the record of taking the same horrific genocidal treatment that American Africans have taken. And the thing is that we've all contributed to each other's societies. There's a cross blending here that, and the fact that American Africans' origins is in the Caribbean before they got here. So there's so many intimate connections there that it doesn't make sense for xenophobia and this sort of anti-immigrant, anti-African narrative to take hold. It's similar to what happened when you had the Great Migration from the South to the cities of the North, whether you're speaking of Chicago, Detroit, New York, LA, and all the other cities in between. And the white people that were already living in the city were told that the Negroes were coming from the South to take their jobs. They didn't care that American Africans were running from the terrorism of the white knights and the Klan and all of that stuff. They're just thinking y'all are invading to take our jobs and to basically filtrify our cities. And they were lynching black people wholesale in northern cities. It's documented all over New York City. They were hanging black people from light posts, setting them ablaze while they were lynching them. They would actually set them on fire at the same time. There's pictures of it. There was a show called The Nick on HBO where they go into detail of some of these riots and show what happened in the discussion after the show. They actually go into the records and pull the newspapers, the New York Times from back then, showing the origin of this being black people migrating north. So they were given a false narrative, and they took out that animosity and that xenophobia on these black people fleeing terrorism in the South.
Well, it wasn't really xenophobia because, and I do see the caller, I'm going to come to you. Thank you for being patient. It wasn't really xenophobia because these were American-born blacks. It was just simply racism.
Right, true. So thanks for that correction, too. But the truth is that innocent people were being killed simply for trying to have a better life and move away from overt, horrific terrorism. And then you have people from other countries that are fleeing terrorism that was created either by the United States or some other European power in their home country. And what else is a person to do if you're trying to survive and make a living for your family, but migrate to the places that are most stable and most prosperous, where you think you can start over and have a good life for yourself and your family. And it turns out to be the same perpetrators of the horrors in their country. Those countries are the ones to go to. Mm-hmm. And when we get here, any benefits we get are benefits the people in control of the system give to us.
Right. Let me make this point before I forget, Ross, because you said it earlier and I forgot. You said that your mother was doing the jobs that other people didn't want to do. Right. But you really clarified something for me when you said that these whites were told in the North that, hey, these Southern blacks is coming up here to take your jobs and whatnot. We're seeing that in this image. I had this ATOS person send me a link to a black conservative website that was demonizing immigrants, I did the research in this Black Conservative Platform organization, foundation. They do have articles of incorporation, so it's not just a hashtag movement. It's an actual organization, but they had this page demonizing immigrants. They coming to take our jobs and all this and that. And so anyway, I did the research, and that website, that platform, that organization was backed by white conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., which is headed by a racist woman. Okay? But let's examine the logic of taking our jobs. The only job you have is the jobs you create yourself. Okay? If you're not an entrepreneur, then that job that you claiming is being taken from you, it ain't yours. You ain't in charge of hiring nobody. It ain't your company. You ain't making no decisions. You filing an application to get a job. It's not your job. And the blame, if you worried about some immigrants fleeing instability and violence in their countries because the United States has done to their country, like what they about to do to Venezuela or try to do to Venezuela, it's those people that run those companies that's giving these immigrants those jobs. That's not your job because you didn't create the company. It ain't yours. It's only your job. It's only a job for you once they hire you. So that's just a fallacy. That's not even logical. How is it going to be my job? All right, I'm getting paid. I'm not even getting paid a livable wage. That's not my job. I didn't create that. I'm working for somebody else. It's their job to give. So just a fallacy of blaming people who have no power or the least power in this country for taking something from me. They ain't take nothing from me. You can't take nothing from me that wasn't mine to begin with, that belonged to a white person who's playing us against each other. But anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. Before I go to this caller, did you want to finish your thought?
Oh, yeah. I was just saying that, you're blaming immigrants for situations they don't have control over. It's the white people in charge that dictate how we become citizens, what we're to do to become citizens, and everything that we're allowed to do is by them. And I'm going to give an example. In Trinidad, the majority of people on the island were slaves at the end when slavery was ended. And the white people did not want the Africans that were newly freed to be in charge of their own autonomy from a political standpoint. So they started bringing in indentured servants from China, very few, but there are some, and from India, which is the lion's share of them, to offset the numbers politically. And today in Trinidad, it's basically split in half between Indians and Africans, but Indians are slightly higher than Africans now. And that was to create that rift which still exists to this day between those two groups. And what you're seeing in this situation is the same thing. It's a way of offsetting two different groups of victims of white supremacy against each other, that basically we become the buffer to the argument between the two different black groups, becomes the buffer to those two black groups coming together to go against the white folks who are in charge of the misery that both groups are suffering from.
Yeah.
So we're falling for the same process over and over and over again.
It's an expression. It's an expression of the crab in the bucket. Okay.
Absolutely.
It's just the latest iteration of the crab in the bucket. Instead of focusing on the person who put us all in the bucket, I'm gonna focus my attention on this other crab who's suffering from racism, white supremacy, and being played against my group by the people in charge, which is white people. All right, let me get this call. Thank you, caller, for being so patient, because you've been hanging in on for a long time. Let me go to this caller. You can give your name if you choose. You can use a pseudonym, but I'm going to 917. Your line is unmuted. Do you have a question or a comment for us?
Peace, greetings, callers and listeners. Thank you, Scotty, for the platform. Greatly appreciated, man. This is Cujo out of NYC.
Hey, what's up, Cujo?
Not much, man. I just was listening, and it's real interesting. I didn't know you guys were going to speak about this because, to be frank, I've heard it. I was listening to Yvette, and I was listening to that dude Antonio, and both times I was just like, this is not making sense. It sounds like there's going to be a divide between the people that are coming, that are African but not born here, then that are not ancestrally enslaved in that aspect, victims, and a divide between the people that are African that are just coming here. And I speak for myself. I'm from the Caribbean as well, and some of what Ross says is very accurate as far as the mentality that my family had towards Black Americans, so-called Black Americans. It was like we didn't look at them like they were different from us. We just knew that they had been beaten down more than we did in some aspects. And we didn't know how until we got here and started educating ourselves. But my mother was big on it. She was very informative about the differences and the things that they may see and we don't see, because we're not used to that type of subjugation outright for white people because they're so few in some of these islands. But that being said, also, you know, the truth was that I got more slack by white people because I had an accent, and it psychologically damaged me to the point that I practiced to talk English as good as possible to not be teased when I was younger. So that would actually be one of the crew. But unbeknownst to me, later on, just like Ross said, when reggae started coming in and calypso and dance hall, and then the music between hip hop and reggae started fusing and all these different cultures were meshing in, it was like, wait a minute, that was something that was going to happen anyway, because at the end of the day, this is really about what you spoke about, the Malcolm X clip and everything, Pan Africanism. So your question earlier about dividing each other, is it going to lead to anything? We've never seen it lead to anything positive. So I don't see how this division with ATOS is going to work. I just don't see it. You know, so I'll mute my line, but thank you for letting me speak, man. Great show, by the way. Thank you. Peace.
Thank you, Cool Joe. And anytime you want to chime back in, you know, we touch on something and you have an experience or insight you want to share, just unmute yourself. Okay. All right. So, yeah, similar experience that you had there, Max. That you had, Ross. His parent instilled in him a level of respect for the struggle that African descendant people, who born here have gone through and what have you. I didn't hear y'all parents, either of you, say your parents taught y'all, them African descendants of slaves is dumb and they ain't worth a damn, they lazy and all of that. Because, I mean, keep it real. Keep it real. Some of the anecdotal evidence that has been used to justify anti-Africanism is you do have elitists in Africa. All of Africa ain't united. All of Africa, everybody and every African in Africa doesn't practice Pan-Africanism. In South Africa, you had some Zulus who were attacking and killing Africans from other countries because they was being xenophobic and, oh, this is our land and we don't care if you look like us, we gonna kill you, you know, because you taking from me. So you know, when you point to a Nigerian actress, and somebody posted a photo saying this Nigerian actress said something bad about African Americans, well, guess what? There ain't no kind of evidence to indict every single Nigerian in that nation as being haters of African American. That's just one person. That's you are again engaging in a form of racism, white supremacy that you learn from racist white supremacists. Okay? That's what they do. They deal in stereotypes. That's why they highlight American descendants of slaves in Chicago killing each other, you know, by the hundreds every year. That's why that's why they highlight that on their evening news or national news, because they want to apply that street mentality, which was brought about, you know, by the conditions created by white supremacists in Chicago to get them, even American descendants of slaves, fighting each other over resources, to the point that they'll kill each other. They do that because they want all black people to be seen as savages. So what sense does it make for us to engage in that same type of behavior? Except for you have internalized white supremacy and you taking on the role of a proxy racist. Ross, let me see. Let me get you unmuted, Ross. Ross, you there?
All right. All right. Yeah. Thanks to Cujo for chiming in with that, because I think it's very important. And I remember years ago, this is in the mid to late 80s, I remember Dr. Ben having a lecture about the rift between immigrant African American Africans. And he said, I remember he said it and everybody started laughing. He said, well, you know, what started to break the ice between the two groups? He said, sex. You know, you find a woman who's attractive, she happens to be from the islands, and you're not thinking of her as this immigrant person, you're just thinking of her as a beautiful sister I want to get with. And ultimately, the cultures melded together, and that is what really broke the ice between the two groups, because to this day, you go to, like, let's say Flatbush in Brooklyn, it is a heavily African and Caribbean immigrant area. There are some American Africans there, but the lion's share of the people there are Caribbean Africans and African immigrants from the continent. And they have a lot of black businesses out there and all kinds of stuff. And the community really gets along well. There isn't any sort of xenophobia in the area at all. I mean, you do have crime and stuff like that because of poverty. But, I mean, as far as the culture of the community, it's a very close-knit community. The people know each other in the respective businesses. They support each other's businesses. And it's just an understanding that goes far beyond the scope of where you come from. That's what really Pan-African means. It just means all African people, no matter where they are, African-descendant people. And just, you're not going to get along with everybody. We have, quote-unquote, bad apples in every group. There's always going to be somebody or multiple people that are going to think a certain way and behave a certain way that is negative, non-productive, and denigrating and self-hating. That's just a byproduct of the system of white supremacy and it being a global phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But the idea, which is what Minister Malcolm had, was to foster those global connections. And when people talk about the fact that Pan-Africanism hasn't created any tangibles, everybody who was Pan-African was shot and killed. So there was no time given to Pan-Africanism for it to do what it has intended to do.
Right.
It's only in recent years that we're starting to get these things happening now.
Right.
Hearing about the building of these 5, what they call them Wakanda cities on the continent, that they intend to be built by diasporan Africans and built in the way in which they see fit. And it's different African countries giving this land up. Right now it's Tanzania and I'm forgetting the other country. They're both giving up land on the border for this to start.
Hey, Tanzania. Go ahead. Tanzania. Yeah. Shout out to Brother Pete out there living in Tanzania, who is a American descendant of victims of slavery, who joined the Black Panther Party, who was targeted by the FBI for neo-slavery and fled to Tanzania, which took him in. And he's still living there.
Yes, you're correct. And so, I mean, when people say Pan-Africanism is dead, it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And really, Pan-Africanism never had a chance. Marcus Garvey, his entire movement was destroyed from within by the first black agent ever.
For the FBI, yep.
Specifically for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So you're literally blaming the victim for the fact that they could not understand the machinations and the depth and danger of the system of white supremacy when you're a black person trying to practice black self-respect and save black lives. So now that we understand these things, some of these leaders are making different tactical moves to circumvent the machinations of white supremacy and bring us together. So we're in the rudimentary stages of that. Go ahead.
Let's talk about killing Pan-Africanism. Now,
sure.
Gaddafi was ethnically a Berber, which is like an Arab-like people. But he was a Pan-Africanist, cause where is Libya but in Africa? And
and all Berbers were not light skinned too. You had black Berbers as well. So I just want to make that known to folks. Yeah, not all Berbers.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But thank you. But he's a Pan-African leader who tried to give, I think it was something like $5 billion to Louis Farrakhan to distribute and help African Americans, black Americans. Okay? The United States blocked that. The Congress, the government blocked that. I didn't see not a single congressional black member say, hey, wait a minute, why are you doing that? We need that money. You're not doing anything to develop our communities and what have you. Then Gaddafi came up. He launched the first communication satellite in Africa so that Africans could have cell phone service and not pay these exorbitant prices to these European telecommunication companies. He did many different projects in Africa and gave them money for development. Okay, Libya was the most prosperous nation in Africa. And when Africans were fleeing from areas like Somalia and other places where Americans and Europeans and NATO is causing disturbances and instability and war, and then you had these people fleeing, trying to get to Europe through Libya, Gaddafi was giving them jobs. Okay? Gaddafi was giving them jobs. Don't tell me Pan-Africanism is dead. It's dead to you because you don't practice it. But if it is dead, it's because that we've been murdering. And when I say we, I don't mean me. But agents of the American government have been murdering these Pan-Africanist leaders and preventing those connections from being made all over the diaspora. One of the last things he did or was proposing to do, what got him killed, was he was proposing that the African nations get on one currency, just like Europe has the euro, and it'll be backed by the gold dinar, and who has more gold and other natural resources than Africa. And that is when that would have meant that all of Africa would have been the economic superpower of the world, and they didn't want that. So what did they do? Under a black president, under the direct direction of Hillary Clinton, who many African descendants of victims of slavery, American descendants of slavery, voted for Hillary Clinton, had that man murdered, publicly called for him. We can't wait till y'all capture or kill him. That's against U.S. law, okay? And that's why they did that, okay? They don't want Africa to be strong, because then Africa, like Malcolm was saying, will be in a position to help the entire diaspora. And what's so sad about it, and again, these are hard truths, and some of us just can't deal with it, you know? But I have long come to terms with my role in being a soldier for white supremacy by what I did in Iraq. But there was a black woman, American descendant of victims of slavery, who was awarded a medal. She was an admiral or some, high officer in the Navy that was launching the planes, from that naval ship to bomb Libya back into the Stone Age. And she was given a medal. She was given a medal. So when you sit up here and tell me that some immigrants, some African immigrants, some Caribbean immigrants coming here is deliberately trying to harm you, but you don't want to take responsibility of our, as American descendants of victims of slavery, of which I am one, and our long, long, long history of being tools of white supremacy and murdering non-white people and stealing their land, and then we don't even get a part in the land. You know what I'm saying? We don't get the spoils of war, other than them butter biscuits, which I call them now, anybody in the military, you just a low-paid mercenary. Because they don't get paid a lot.
Yeah, and then you come back, go back to your native city and get gunned down unarmed in the street by a cop. that has happened to quite a few of our people that were in the military. They just get caught up in the random situations that white supremacy creates, and they serve their country, whether it was on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. But then you come back to the place that you were born, and you die as a quote-unquote civilian at the hands of some psychopath. It's real deep. It's deep. You know, I remember my father telling me that I was not to join the military, and he said that was his reasoning. He said, you're not fighting for a country that you can walk the streets of New York City and possibly get your brains blown out just for being black.
Right.
He said, now, if this was a just country, then I would have no problem with you signing up. If they were doing things properly and treating black people like human beings, then no problem with you signing up and representing for your country and doing what you have to do if they, ask you to do
But I'm sure he wasn't talking about as long as they treating us right, it's okay to help them mistreat other people in the world. That's not
no. He means
right.
that they're on the right side of history, and and of
right.
course, like you don't have the probability of being killed on the streets of your, wherever you grew up, because of the color of your skin. If this country was just in practicing justice and propagating justice, then it's no problem for you to join the military.
Yeah, to defend this.
Yeah, doing, no way.
Right, right. Yeah, I had to have the same conversation with my daughter when she wanted to join the Air Force. I set a bad example. I learned from Malcolm X and reading books and seeing my role as a tool of white supremacy that I will not allow you to do that to yourself and to other people. No, it's not going to happen. And of course, she could have joined anyway, but out of respect for me, she didn't join. I do see we have another caller. I want to play this Malcolm X clip on Africanism and organization real quick, and then we'll come to the other caller. You're listening to Black Talk Radio News with Scotty Reed on the Black Talk Radio Network. We're being joined in conversation about this xenophobia and anti-Africanism elements within the hashtag movement ADOS. I just don't see how why somebody has to hate on other victims of white supremacy in order to advocate for something for themselves. I just don't see why. There's no justification for it. But anyway, this is Malcolm X talking about Africanism and organization.
Most people, when we say Afro-American, they think only of the Negroes in the United States. But they don't realize that 2/3 of Brazil consists of people of African blood, which means they're also Afro-American because Brazil is in South America. And in all of these, many of these countries in South America and Central America, and even in Canada, they are heavily populated with people whose ancestors came from Africa. So when you total up the number of Afro-Americans, real Afro-Americans, in the Western Hemisphere, there are perhaps 100 million. And if these people ever unite among themselves, not only is it necessary for the Afro-Americans in the United States to be organized, but it's also necessary for the Afro-Americans in the Caribbean, or the Afro-Cubans, the Afro-Brazilians. It's necessary for all of them to be organized. And then once they are organized in each place, we have to organize among ourselves so that the Afro-American in the United States will be working in conjunction in a coordinated program with those who are in Cuba and those in Brazil and those in Venezuela and those throughout the Caribbean and Haiti and in the West Indian Islands. And in this way, we actually get strength. And it's not an accident that there's no organization existing in the Western Hemisphere that's designed toward that end. It would be a direct threat to imperialism as it really exists, and to colonialism as it exists in the West. And one of the things that's going to help to bring this about is the independence of Africa. And one of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image. And because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image, those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is, and we begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood, our African heritage. And this is what is beginning to make the Africans in the Western Hemisphere today develop more race pride And as this race pride develops, then it has a tendency to make us want to unite together and work together. And your Western imperialists and colonialists consider this to be a grave threat, more threat than communism or Marxism or socialism or anything else. The Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat.
All right, that was Malcolm X, who was regrettably assassinated on this day. I forget the exact year, and he's exactly right, and that's why I have to reconnect and see what I can do to support in Cobra. And I'm gonna come to you, caller, but let me just inform people: if you are an American descendant of victims of slavery, because our ancestors were not slaves, they were enslaved. They were human beings who were kidnapped, put through human trafficking, and enslaved. Slave is a dehumanizing term. Stop using it. They were victims of slavery. But let me look up some information on Cobra. Again, through the New Abolitionist movement, which I created in 2014 when I launched New Abolitionist Radio, we were lobbying these different groups representing black people who were talking about reparations or talking about black struggle. There was another movement, they kind of lost steam now, but they were trying to create something like a political organization for black people. And they had come out with a platform, and I was like, please add to your platform a plank in there that says that the U.S. never stopped practicing slavery. They created a new form of slavery through the prisons and the court system, and it's codified in the 13th Amendment. Yes, we want reparations for the labor of our ancestors. But a lot of people just don't know that after 1865 in the Civil War and the invention of convict leasing, how black people were subjected to black codes, put into prison, and then leased out back to plantations, to the mining companies, and to the railroads. We hear a lot about how Chinese immigrants built the railroads. And yes, they contributed. Irish people contributed as well. Black people contributed to the building of the railroads, but those black people were convicts from the prison labor camps that had been. That's the continuation of slavery. You can't advocate for reparations for something that happened to your ancestor and not tack on a few $trillion for the continued slavery. But and you can check our website, and I'm going to leave them up. I'm not going to take them down. But I was just defending ATOS the other day until some of my Pan African brothers and sisters informed me more about the xenophobia and anti-Africanism espoused by the leaders. Okay? So if you want to fight for reparations, you want an organization that has a charter, that has been doing this for decades, then I recommend the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, because they are engaged in what Malcolm X was just talking about. They're not just working to get reparations from the United States for American blacks, but they're part of an international coalition as well of Jamaicans trying to get reparations from the UK, from other Caribbean nations. Because if we all band together, okay, there's power in numbers, like he said, and we can advocate for each other to get reparations from whoever owes each distinct group reparations. But let me give y'all some information. We are the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. The National Coalition of Blacks for Reparation in America is the premier mass-based coalition of organizations and individuals organized for the sole purpose of attaining reparations for African descendants in the United States. In COBRA's founding meeting, September 26, 1987, was convened for the purpose of broadening the base of support for the long-standing reparations movement. NCOBRA has individual members, national and local organizational members, and organizational affiliates. NCOBRA has chapters, members, affiliates, and supporters throughout the U.S. and in Africa, Europe, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. NCOBRA is directed nationally by a board of directors, not two YouTube famous personalities, but they got a board of directors. NCOBRA's campaign and work is organized through 9 national commissions: economic development, human resources, legal strategies, legislation, information, and media, membership and organizational development, international affairs, youth and education, and 7 standing committees: nomination, executive conference, fund development, ASH, I don't know what that stands for, National Office and National Campaigns. And NCOBRA holds an annual national membership meeting and conference, usually held the 4th weekend in June, to conduct the business of the coalition, as well as to evaluate and introduce new campaigns and strategies. They do have a donate button. Again, this is a registered nonprofit. These aren't just people you giving money to on the internet. This is an actual coalition that has been doing this work since 1987. If you're looking to join a movement for reparations, I suggest joining this movement, because they are practicing the very principles that Malcolm X just got through talking about. Let me go to our caller. 917, area code 917. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for joining us tonight in this conversation. Go ahead, give us your name or pseudonym, and share with us your comments or questions.
Okay, my name is Basil. Good evening to the brothers. Great program. I am an immigrant. I came here when I was 16 years old. I didn't come with my parents. I came straight to go to university. And just to give a little bit, I learned about being black in America from the so-called black Americans. They're the ones that taught me. So some of the tropes, immigrants, that is often thrown around by some folks, I don't resonate with that at all. But there are a couple of things I wanted to point out listening to your conversation. I remember back in the 80s, Dr. Iva Carruthers was doing a lecture at First World. And she started and she said a very important thing. It's not good to ask the wrong question and have the right answer. It's better to ask the right question and not have the answer. When I look at the so-called, what they call this ADOS, they're asking the wrong question and thinking they have the right answer. The xenophobia, because myself and you get Carnell, I've had back and forth with her, and I just realized that, you know what, this is a waste of time. So I observe them passively every day whenever I see their stuff on social media. The other thing, you were talking about justice, and what's interesting, you're talking about brother, oh gosh, now his name slips me.
Mr. Neely Fuller?
Yes, Mr. Neely Fuller. We have a system, Ma'at, from our ancient Kemetic ancestors. We as African people, we need Ma'at, and the rest of the world needs Ma'at. Because, just to go over what Ma'at is: justice, reciprocity, balance, harmony, truth, order, and compassion. I would say we as African people, we need that to heal ourselves, to restore who we are, and to work together. Another thing I find interesting is that language and definitions are really important. And you pointed out something really great just now when you said our ancestors were enslaved. They were not slaves, right? And I think that is a very important distinction. So that's another thing, this ADOS, it doesn't make any sense. They want to make it seem as though everything started out of the Ma'afa, as my mentor, Marimba Annie, coined it. It came out of the Ma'afa. We were doing things before the Ma'afa. So our ancestors were enslaved. And The other thing there are two more things I want to point out. The Republic of New Africa had a great definition for us. I listened to Malcolm, what Malcolm was just talking about. Just reminded me of what they coined the definition, calling us in the Americas New Africans because of the history that we all shared: enslavement, colonialism, and now neo-colonialism. So someone come from Brazil, they're New African from Brazil. You come from where I come from, Guyana, you're a New African from Guyana, a New African from Trinidad, New African from the United States. So we always understand we're a nation, but we just spread all over the Americas.
Right, right.
Different African nations on the continent.
Hey, Basil, let me interject something about the definition of nation, because definitions are important, and I had looked this up. A nation isn't just a formal government. Another definition of nation is people with a shared culture, a shared history, and a shared language.
Correct. You know what? I once told Eva Carnell that Africans, American Africans, if we want to use that term, are a nation within a nation. I referenced to her, I said, go read a book called Reparations. Yes. In the late 80s in college, I came across in a class, that's where I got to understand about N'Cobra in the late 80s. And this book was written by Chokwe Lumumba and Taifa and Tichi and another brother who was part of the New African Republic. And they gave the legal breakdown about reparations, and I would recommend, the book is a hard book to find. It's really expensive now, but it's a really great book to understand it, because one of the interesting themes coming out of that book was Africans coming out of enslavement, or even prior to enslavement here in the United States. There were four perspectives. There was those who wanted to repatriate back to Africa. There were those who wanted to repatriate to other parts of the Americas. There were those who wanted to carve out a piece here in North America to have their own nation state. And there were those who wanted to be full American citizens, which all four are all legitimate. One isn't better than the other, right? And they were never given the opportunity to have a plebiscite amongst them to determine which way they wanted to go. According to what the Reparations says, our legal argument, the 14th Amendment was what was used to colonize African people, because coming out of enslavement, they then had the same status as the homicide case. They were not subject to the laws of the United States. There were a bunch of people roaming, if you want to say, in the United States that the United States had no legal status over. So what they do the 14th Amendment, so they have legal control over African people here. And that's a history that some, like the Claude Andersons of the world, don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with the Carnells of the world. They don't want to deal with that because their whole standing would be like a house of cards would fall apart. But the last thing I wanted to say about Pan Africanism, which a lot of people don't seem to realize, Pan Africanism could never die, because all of us Africans here in the Americas are the walking, living embodiment of Pan Africanism. We are an amalgamation of many African tribes. That's why Pan Africanism came out of us. We're the ones that influenced those folks on the continent about Pan Africanism, because we are the embodiment of that. It was Pan Africanism that caused our ancestors to rebel and resist enslavement, and why we are still here today. So when anyone says Pan Africanism is dead, they're ahistorical and don't even understand our history in America. I thank you, brothers. Great show, and have a great night.
Thank you. You educated me on some things, especially pertaining to the 14th Amendment, because I've heard other arguments that weren't really explaining it to me of how that harmed African descendant people coming out of enslavement, how they like you said, you had four groups. Some that wanted to repatriate back to Africa, and they did. That's what Liberia represents today. Others, wanted to go to South America or Central America. Malcolm talked about the Afro-Descendant people there and what. But the key thing though is the plebiscite. You didn't give them an option to or the land. To create their own nation. In other words, you brought them under the subjugation of the U.S. government, okay? Taxation without representation. So thank you for enlightening me on that. Also, you mentioned the Republic of New Africa. That's another group that I contacted and got them to connect with the new abolitionist movement and recognizing that slavery ain't never been abolished. If you can read English and got an 8th grade comprehension level, and you read the 13th Amendment, which says involuntary servitude and slavery shall be abolished, except as punishment for a crime whereof a person has been duly convicted, then how can you claim to abolish something while you carving out an exception? You didn't abolish it. You created a new form of slavery called neo-slavery to be practiced against Afro-Descendant people through the court system and the prisons. And they were receptive to that. And, they also participated, my organization, Black Talk Media Project, we helped fund the march. It was called the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights March in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. And the Republic of New Africa had representatives there who were among the speakers that spoke on that day. But you said it best, man. Pan Africanism can never die because we are the embodiment of that Pan Africanism, because I was, pushing back against that by saying, wait a minute, here's my Trinidadian brother who has supported the work of my organization through financial donations, through participation in the media that we're producing. I'm talking about Ross. Then I have a volunteer who's in the UK who done some stat work for us, just some technical stuff behind the scene, didn't even want to be paid. She's in the UK, never met her face to face, only talked to her through Skype and whatever, but she believed so strongly in the mission of the Black Talk Media Project, she was like, let me volunteer my skill. That's Pan-Africanism. As I told somebody else today, I recently, the new abolitionist movement, and I can't go because of my health right now, my physical limitations. But we were invited to Ghana because slavery, legalized slavery through the prisons, are being practiced in Africa. Okay? And they heard us over the internet via Black Talk Radio Network, and they were saying, dang, that's what's happening here. And we want you brothers to come here to help us start a movement, a new abolitionist movement against this legalized slavery that's being practiced in Ghana, okay? And then I was recently contacted by a missionary on the behalf of a Nigerian Christian pastor who they found my work and want me to come there to help them set up their own independent digital radio station. Pan-Africanism is not dead. Ross, any comments on what we heard from our guests?
Yes, when we talked earlier, I almost verbatim said exactly what he said, that we are an amalgamated African people. You had groups that were killing each other before they were kidnapped and enslaved. And these people were forced to create something new with each other. And like he said, we are the living DNA embodiment of Pan-Africanism. The one thing I did want to also say is Pan-Africanism is a very, very ancient concept. It's not new. And Dr. Chancellor Williams, in his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, outlines the origin of the Pan-African mindset continentally, going back many thousands of years, and it was based on something called lineage ties. In other words, our ancestors knew that they came from a common source, and that was the bargaining chip that was used between groups to mitigate conflict Excuse me. And this was something that was done continent-wide. He did studies with well over 100 plus tribes all over the continent to get this information. And we had nonviolent conflict resolution, which is something that, if anyone has ever seen the movie Shaka Zulu, when the Brits first get to South Africa, and I believe it's Dingiswayo's army is having another battle with another group, and they never actually come to blows. They stand apart and they do like these scary war dances with their spears. And one of the Brits actually say they call this warfare. They're not even like killing each other, and they like kind of laugh at what they call warfare. But that was because we had learned that killing made no sense. So, and also we knew that our origins, we had the same origin. So ultimately, knowing that pretty much we were brothers, far removed, depending on where we were displaced on the continent, what they did was they created these different war dances. And he talks about the fact that the two groups would try to scare each other in the war, and they would even sit next to each other when they would take breaks from combat and kid and joke with each other before going back to practice this nonviolent combat. But when you study the animal kingdom, you see the same thing is true. Animals will wrestle each other for dominance, and one animal will give way to the stronger animal to avoid them killing each other. Sometimes they do kill each other, but the ultimate goal is for them to propagate their genes. So it doesn't make sense for them to go about killing each other all the time. And that's what we were doing back then before our contact with outsiders facilitated. It started before them, but it facilitated wholesale killing amongst our people on the continent.
You know, another example of Pan-Africanism that we talked about earlier today off air was I don't know if I want to call it the Charleston Rebellion, because, you know, somebody snitched and there was a slaughter of, you know, the free black people. They burnt down that church, Mother Emanuel Church, where Dylan Roof, the white supremacists, went up in there and that church was at the center of a planned rebellion between Denmark Vesey, who had formerly been enslaved but got his freedom and was a part of that church that was run by free black people, and he was plotting with an enslaved African by the name of Gullah Jack, okay? And what they were going to do was stage a rebellion, hijack a ship in the port of Charleston, and sail off to Haiti. That was a demonstration of Pan-Africanism, because they weren't from the same tribe. And even at that time, Denmark Vesey had the status of being free, as much as you could be free under white supremacy at that time. And Gullah Jack was enslaved. So that was an embodiment of Pan-Africanism at that time that we talked about earlier. Well, go ahead, Ross.
I was just going to say, just to finish my previous thought, it makes sense that the people that will resurrect an ancient ideal of brotherhood across the continent would be the victims of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, because of our experiences and the fact that we were forced amalgamated with one another in order to come together to get some semblance of black self-respect and complete dominance in the Western Hemisphere of colonialist white supremacists. So that's the beauty of everything. When you talk about the resurrection of chematology, that started with Western Hemispheric African people. And that knowledge of what Kemet had to offer then spread to other parts of the continent. They forgot who they were. That's how brutalized they were in their own land. So we got to stop blaming the victims and understand we have a common enemy, we have a common history and a common origin, and that we can do things to help each other seek justice against the people who have enslaved us directly on the specific lands we come from. And that's not from practicing xenophobia and self-hatred. It's about amalgamating our force together to have a unified front, like they did, in order to put us in the position we're in right now.
What last thing I want to talk about, Ross, and I was talking to my sister that's in the UK earlier today, and you know, I have invited her to be a guest on the program, but you know, she has been so stressed out from her job and what have you, as she's on some kind of special assignment. But she's going to come on at a later date. But we talked for about an hour today using Skype, and we were talking about the political strategy, how it makes no sense. And I told her, you know why I'm calling it a hashtag movement? Because that's all it is right now. I said they haven't they're not like in Cobra. They haven't organized and started a organization, okay? And what they're just YouTube personalities who created a hashtag, and now you got and not all of them, so let me make that clear, but a lot of them have been attacking me, and I'm calling you created an army of Twitter bullies, is what you did, okay? That's nothing going to come of that. That's like a fad. Fads come and go. You're not building anything sustainable, not based on xenophobia, because look, reparations has to come through politics, the people activity area of politics. You have to lobby Congress. They have to set aside the funds to pay reparations. I think in Cobra estimates that I think it's $22 trillion that they want. It'll come out to $250,000 for every African descendant of slavery victims of the U.S. government. And so I'm saying now, since you got to go through politics to get reparations from the U.S. government, you can only, there's one or two ways that you can, one or two avenues that you're going to have to go through. That's the Republican Party and that's the Democratic Party. We can go ahead and scratch the Republican Party off right now, okay? Because the Republican Party is not ever been and never will be for reparations, okay? So that leaves you with the Democratic Party. And again, you have about 22, I think it's 22, I don't know if all of them still alive, but it's a significant number of black representatives in Congress, part of the Congressional Black Caucus, who have co-signed and sponsored, H.R. 40. I think it's H.R. 40. Let me see if this is on in Cobras. Well, whatever the name of that bill is, that just languages in committee all the time. I said, so that means you need them to do that, right? Well, when it comes to politics, you have to be very codified. Do you think that any of them black representatives right now, the way the Democratic Party is pushing back against xenophobia, not because they really care about those immigrants, because if they cared about them, they wouldn't be voting to bomb their countries or overthrow their countries, creating these refugees in the first place, okay? But you're going to have to go through the Democratic Party. Do you think that those elected representatives are going to allow themselves to be connected to a xenophobic movement, which then can be used against them as political ammunition? No, they're not. So what are you going to do? What's your end goal here? That's why it's important when Neely Fuller talks about codification. Mr. Fuller said something to me, not said it to me, but said it to us all, that made a lot of sense. He said, he ain't talking about when we speaking among ourselves or on Black Talk Radio Network on whatever program we're talking about racism or white supremacy, or they're both the same thing. Because Neely Fuller says racism is white supremacy. He doesn't say racism, white supremacy. That's like, what's the proper name for it? That's like redundant. Okay? Racism is white supremacy. Okay? But he said when you go to a public town hall to talk to an elected official about racism, we know the R word is a trigger word for racists. Soon as you accuse them of practicing racism and what have you, it's going to be immediate pushback against that. And they're going to start talking about you playing the race card, or they're going to start talking about reverse racism and all that stuff. So he said, and instead of letting it get to the point to where then it's unconstructive and two groups are in this public town hall accusing each other of practicing racism or reverse racism or playing the race card and all that, can you describe racism without using the word racism? That means you got to expand your vocabulary. That you can talk about the mistreatment without using racism. He's talking about codification. Okay? And this is especially useful on the job. And that's why he talks about asking questions. You just don't come out outright and make accusations without documentation. You got to have the documentation, okay? If you got a documentation, then that's a different story. When you can point to the data and accuse somebody of racism, where it's in the data. It's not me calling you a racist. The data's calling you a racist. But he talks about if you're being mistreated on the job, don't just come out and say, you mistreating me because of racism. No, you be more codified. You go to the employee handbook and you say, hey, this employee handbook says that I work third shift and I'm supposed to get this actually happened to me. I'm supposed to get $1 extra an hour for working third shift. Am I not getting it because I'm black? I don't have to say that. All I have to say is the employee handbook says I work third shift. I'm on third shift. Where's my extra $1 per hour? You know what I'm saying? Without using the R word. I know it's racism. They know it's racism. But as soon as I call them a racist, then it's going to be a bunch of deflection. You playing the race card. How dare you? And blah, 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 blah. So I really appreciate that. Again, you know, when there's direct evidence of racism, call it racism. But when you don't have that direct evidence, can you explain the mistreatment that you are suffering without using the R word in a town hall? That's codification. Does that make any sense to you, Ross?
Absolutely. It's something else that he said that I've actually taught some coworkers, some black female coworkers on the job. You never directly accuse a white person of racism, because at that point the conversation stops and then the onus is on you to prove that they're racist. What you do is, like you said, you deal with the issue. You might use the Constitution or you use the company handbook. And if they are practicing racism, you don't say that they're racist. You might say, I suspect that you may be practicing racism on me. And you can use examples. Racists do X, Y, Z and say this and such, and you did X, Y, Z and said such and such, which coincides with something that a racist would say. So I suspect that you're practicing. Or if another powerful white person chooses to also call that other white person a racist, then you have someone who's backing you up, who has the power to make something happen. And that's very rare that one white person will do that to another in defense of a non-white person. So the idea is that you never use the R word directly. You deal with the actual circumstance and you describe it in a way as such that it's properly interpreted by the wordplay you're using without being directly accusatory. Because then at that point you're playing lawyer and you're going to be the one that has to prove now why this person is a racist.
Now, also,
and if you don't have that evidence, you're messing yourself up. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the importance of documentation and keeping a journal on the job. But earlier today, I talked about if you are relying on these white platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as your sole base of operations, okay, then you're setting yourself up for white people to kick you off at any time because that's their platform. And let's just say some powerful immigrant that is in Congress. Let's say, what's her name up there in Minnesota, the woman from Somalia that's a congresswoman now?
Oh, Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, Ilhan Omar. All right. Or let's say it's a Hispanic congressman. And or some of their constituents say, hey, I'm on YouTube and I was listening to this channel and they're demonizing and saying derogatory things about immigrants, which is a protected class under federal law in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which says you cannot discriminate against people by national origin. Also, xenophobia is a form of racism. And so these people have their terms of service with these platforms. By you being uncodified, you're setting yourself up to lose your base of operations. Then what you gonna do? Number one, your xenophobia is incorrect, it's unjust, it's not practicing justice, and it's just flat out wrong. And it's not rooted in any kind it's not pointing towards any kind of solution. Okay? But your whole base of operation is on white people's websites and stuff. You're not even practicing black self-respect by having enough sense to create your own platform. Okay? So, again, I just don't know how long this is going to last because you are so uncodified. You act like, for some educated people with college degrees, you act like you was born yesterday and you don't know how this works. No politician is going to pick up your platform or push your agenda and they find out and it's pointed out to them, these are xenophobic people. Because then they give their opponents and future races ammunition against them. Does that make sense, Ross?
Completely done. And then they're not going to align themselves with anything that can be overtly traced to xenophobia or racism. It's just not going to happen. And I think that the approach is just, it's going to bear itself out as time progresses, but it's just a completely incorrect approach. And the best way to do things is to work holistically with people. And if there's something that immigrants don't know, then why not
educate them?
Once they understand, okay, well, if maybe there's something that we can do to help facilitate your struggle. Mm-hmm. But when you do all this separatist nonsense, you're really setting yourself up, because think about this. When the economy collapses, a lot of people in America are going to be seeking to flee America. And there's a lot of people in other countries that actually have a lot of admiration and respect for American Africans. So if you start mistreating and abusing these people, these are the same people that might close their doors when you want or need to come to them for assistance.
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
Right.
This is something that is just, it's like cutting your nose to spite your face. And then the people that you show the most vitriol for are the people who look like you. Wow, how cliche in a system of white supremacy.
Yeah.
It's just sad. So we just have work to do to really overcome this kind of stupidity. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, Ross, we've been on for 2.5 hours. I didn't plan to go this long, but hey, I hope it was constructive. If you think it was constructive, please share it with other people. Pan Africanism is not dead. There is strength in numbers. And there is an organization called NCOBRA that's been about that work. And it's an international organization that is more credible than a hashtag movement. And with that, I'm going to close it out with Malcolm X, who a portion of his speech at the Oxford University debates. And it's mainly talking about practicing justice and uniting with people who want to practice justice to overthrow this evil system, white supremacy, that's subjecting us all to mistreatment. I want to thank our callers, and again, thank you, Ross. I'm not sure when I'll be back on with a live broadcast, but I'm trying to produce more podcasts. Again, if you're interested in joining our Black Media Collective, you can join us, become a podcaster, audio podcast. You can upload video podcasts. I have tutorials. The equipment doesn't cost that much to produce a professional podcast, and you can even use it with video. I had those tutorials on blacktalkradionetwork.com. If you need one-on-one help, I'm here for that. I'll help you over, we got a conference line where we can see each other's screens, and I can make sure, identify any mistakes you might be making in your settings or whatnot. But if you want to become an independent black media producer, hey, maybe you just want to write a blog. Join with us at Black Talk Radio Network for just $24 a year. Can you go to Blog Talk Radio and pay $24 a year and upload unlimited podcasts? No, you can't. You can't go to SoundCloud. I think there's like $10, $20 a month to upload podcasts and distribute podcasts. You can't do it. We're just $24 a year. We've been around for 11 years now. November will mark our 12th year. We've only been here through the grace of God and the donations from a very small group of people, less than 300. But we've been making it work. But we are in danger of shutting down. And we want to try to obtain 1,000 subscribers at $24 a year. Again, You'll have access to Black Talk Radio Network platform as a publisher, video, audio, writing, and you'll also get access to our social media community that Black people told me we needed. So I built it, called BTRcommunity.com. That's how you can help us sustain our independent Black media efforts, where we are free to speak truth to power without being afraid of somebody suspending us and kicking us off of a platform that we did not build and do not own. All right, that said, recognize the fact we live behind the enemy lines of USA Inc. They still practicing slavery by law, and we need to end it. And we need to do it as soon as possible, as Malcolm would say, by any means necessary.
The most famous debating societies in the world. And on his feet at this moment, Malcolm X, one of the leaders of the black Muslims in America. Let's, for a moment, just hear a little of what he's saying.
You make my point. That as long as a white man does it, it's all right. A black man is supposed to have no feelings. But when a black man strikes back, he's an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy. No matter what kind of attack, be it verbal or otherwise, he's supposed to take it. But if he stands up and in any way tries to defend himself, then he's an extremist. No, I think that the day that the black man takes an uncompromising step and realizes that he's within his rights, when his own freedom is being jeopardized, to use any means necessary to bring about his freedom or put a halt to that injustice, I don't think he'll be by himself. I live in America where there are only 22 million blacks against probably 160 million whites. One of the reasons that I'm in no way reluctant or hesitant to do whatever is necessary to see that black people do something to protect themselves, I honestly believe that the day that they do, many whites will have more respect for them, and that there will be more whites on their side than are now on their side with these little wishy-washy love thy enemy approach that they've been using up to now. And if I'm wrong, then you are racialists. Anytime you live in a society supposedly based upon law, and it doesn't enforce its own law because the color of a man's skin happens to be wrong, then I say those people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice where the government can't give them justice. I read once, passingly, about a man named Shakespeare. I only read about him passingly, but I remember one thing he wrote that kind of moved me. He put it in the mouth of Hamlet, I think it was, who said, "To be or not to be." He was in doubt about something. Whether it was nobler in the mind of man to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, moderation, or to take up arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing, end them. And I go for that. If you take up arms, you'll end it. But if you sit around and wait for the one who's in power to make up his mind that he should end it, you'll be waiting a long time. And in my opinion, the young generation of whites, blacks, browns, whatever else there is, you're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built, and the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods. And I, for one, will join in with anyone, don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable condition that exists on this earth. Thank you.